In the long, rich history of boxing, many have distinguished themselves as great. But who is the greatest? And how do we even measure that? One man has measured that. The Boxing Librarian has released his top 1,000 boxers of all time. And we are going to take a deep dive into how on earth he managed this. I'm your host, Bobby, and this is Random Acoustic Thoughts. Join me now as we try to crack the BL code. Welcome everybody, thanks for tuning in. This is part 2 of my response to the Boxing Librarian's epic top 1,000 boxers of all time. What's up BL? Shout out to Scrapbook Boxing, and this is addressed directly to the Boxing Librarian, but I appreciate everyone for listening, and leave comments below if you have any thoughts. Okay, let's jump right in. So just to explain how I went about this, first off I charted the top 40 from the last 3 countdowns, from the top 400, 500, and 1000. And just took a look to see who moved up and down as you added stat categories. This gave me sort of a sense of how the countdown has evolved, and when further categories are added, it's just a different approach, a broader approach, but there are inevitably overlaps in these categories. So what I'm trying to do is, for the competition faced and the competition beaten score, I'm trying to define what part of the total countdown is going to really count the most toward an opposition score and an opposition beaten score. And I also need to navigate many forks in the road. The first of which is how is the opposition faced score weighted compared to the opposition beaten? Because by its very nature, these athletes have all fought more high-level fights than they've won, except for the rare undefeated fighter like Floyd. So if you just add a 1 point for each, then really the opposition element of the final equation is going to carry more weight numbers-wise than the opposition beaten aspect, unless there are overlaps in the opposition beaten as far as stat categories, or those are weighted somehow. And depending on how a system weights the different, broad elements, you can get some different results. There may be slight differences, but in attempting to navigate this, first off, I charted out the top 40s, and then I went down and started listing from the countdowns, listing, okay, who fought the most at a Hall of Fame level, and who won the most at a Hall of Fame level. Now, what about like a broader category like rated champ and Hall of Famers, which does favor the more modern fighters because there are more champs and the ratings era didn't kick in until the 20s. So I have to take some small amount of what I know from watching so many of your pre-ratings era videos and videos for fighters who overlapped between, their prime body of work against fighters who never achieved a ranking because of the timing, and also fighters who did achieve a ranking at some point. In this system, that with the opposition score, I know that you know a lot about a lot of these careers, especially these old ones, and most certainly the ones that are really in that pool, say the top 50. You know a lot about all these guys. You are able to go in and score them fight to fight if you want. I'm having to make a lot of assumptions here, and I'm also having to do this without creating my own database the size of yours and trying to replicate it exactly. I'm trying to sort of read the tea leaves. So what I did was take all the most accomplished in terms of Hall of Fame fights and wins, and then rated fights and wins, and then championship level fights and wins against champions, not championship fights. For an opposition score, it's about the athlete themselves. It's not about the trinket. Although fighting someone who had achieved championship status in their career does count, but the actual title doesn't necessarily count. We're talking about opposition faced and opposition beaten, not collecting belts. And because of that, certain fighters who, from my estimation, were in the top 40 largely due to like individual titles won or things that relate to the accumulation of belts rather than the difficulty of attaining those belts, because not all champions are created equally, and even not all Hall of Famers are created equally, and there are a lot of old school fighters who should be in the Hall of Fame. So, you know, over this whole thing, I'm having to sort of eyeball it a great deal, because there is no clear overarching statistic that covers absolutely everything evenly, all the way back. And that includes the pound for pound rankings. Not that they weren't well done, they were excellently done, but it was harder to become pound for pound back in the day, in the early era, when lots of fighters were having epic years with a ridiculous level of work, to where, you know, fast forward 100 years, you don't have to do as much to be among those who did the most. A lot of the richest eras involve that. Lots of fights against guys while they're in their primes. And it's not like that today. You know, say someone's prime, it can last longer today. That doesn't mean that they're going to have more fights in their prime compared to, you know, someone who's going out there once a month during their prime years instead of twice a year. So I've had to eyeball this, and I've had to sort of do a lot of guesstimating and then try to find numbers to either confirm or refute my guesstimations. I didn't want to go in and just add up a bunch of numbers. What I'm doing is trying to think it through somewhat in the abstract, and then go in and try to basically disprove my own thing. Like, if I can find evidence that my intuition is incorrect, then I would follow that. But I am starting largely from intuition, having watched hundreds of your videos and having sort of in the last 3 years soaked myself in boxing history, at least to the degree that my schedule's allowed. The next step in sort of getting this sense, firstly I started, you know, with the top 13. I felt like all of those would end up in the top 25 in the existing countdown, all top 13. And then when I got to 13, you know, now we're going to hash out and then have 25, but basically a loose prediction of top 25, and I'm fairly confident that within those 25 maybe I can narrow it down more and get most of the top 15 correctly done. So what I did is started noting all time without going in and, you know, assigning points and using multipliers. That all that comes later. First off, I just went in and I listed from the charts I'd handwritten, I listed the top guys in the different stat categories that I felt would be relevant to a fight-to-fight opposition score, and just make note of where they are in those categories all time, and then have that information all next to each other, so I can start seeing a series of like generic listings. And it's important to note that in these countdowns, like if you do a top 50, well, there are a lot of ties, especially when you get past 6 or 7. In a lot of these countdowns, there are like groups of people, you know, say in Hall of Fame wins. Okay, well, number 1 is Greb, but, you know, number 10 is shared by Ali and Gene Tunney, Sammy Angot, Leo Hook, and Coco Kidd. They all have 11 each, so they all share 10th place. So if you're 40th on the list, that might just mean you have, say, the 14th most in a category. And having all this information next to each other in front of me in a way I can digest from both angles, from the numerical ranking, but like if you're doing a tiebreaker on whoever achieved that in the shortest career, well, in this kind of thing where I'm guesstimating overall opposition score, the tiebreaker goes the other way, because a longer career is going to have more lesser fights, and if they count for something, that's actually a bonus. So that was something I was able to use to partly guide me, was in your stat countdowns. So say at number 6 in Hall of Fame wins, McLarnin and Archie Moore and Benny Leonard, they're all tied for 6th most with an incredible 16 Hall of Fame wins, right? McLarnin came at the top of that list because he did it in the least amount of time. But for my purposes, I'm looking at who had the most fights. If I'm sort of just in my brain, if I'm just trying to get a semi-abstract sense of who's likely to add enough points, even if it's a lesser point value per win. And so And then there are other mitigating circumstances, because obviously Hall of Fame and rated and all this, there's no one category that weighs more than everything else put together. So it's really sort of a blend and like 3 or 4 key elements, and then I look and sort of like in my head shuffle it around and try to figure out who overall gets the most points. Now, number 1 in the prediction is easy, because Sam Langford's stats are so ridiculous, and the level of competition and the number of fights, the number of significant fighters he fought, even outside the pound for pound or champions or Hall of Famers. There were a lot of serious guys who may have never made your pound for pound lists, and as you mentioned in your live chat, every fight counts. So it's just that some count a lot more than others. And so depending on how you assigned, I'm assuming you went through with your knowledge, and for the pre-ratings era, you either looking at records or knowing the fighters' careers and sort of giving a points value to each opponent. And then maybe that would also be the points value for the win if you're using a 1-to-1 ratio. You could also use a 2-to-1 ratio to find a balance in how these things are going to weigh in the final equation, where you have the current ranking, their point score, and you have an opposition score, and then you have the opposition beaten. So it wouldn't be unreasonable to double the points in the opposition beaten category, or even triple them, so that having a fight is important in the end, but really winning is more important than just participating. That sort of like helped give me the beginnings, and like just to give an example, so rated champs and Hall of Famers, obviously that doesn't include the pre-ratings era guys, are going to be hurt a little bit by this, but just looking at the ratings era and people overlapped into it, and then people who had a significant enough number of fights in, against champs and Hall of Famers to push up these numbers. So, number 1 in that category is Rosenbloom. He won 82 of his 146 fights against either rated champs or Hall of Famers. Now, he doesn't have the most Hall of Fame fights or the most Hall of Fame wins, but he does place in those in the upper echelon. So just based on that, as far as the ratings era guys, Rosenbloom is going to score extremely high, being first in fights and wins against the combined rated champs and Hall of Famers. So even if you go in with your vast knowledge in detail and assign a varying amount of points for each of those fights, I can see at a glance, well, obviously he's going to score immensely high, because his opposition score is going to be berserk, and his opposition beaten, at least numerically in the combined category, has no equal. In this kind of statistical analysis, having more fights is in and of itself a great thing, because if they're worth something, like if you have 10 fights of equal value, but the other guy had 50 other fights, even low-level fights, it's going to tip the scales. It just might take a lot of low-level fights to tip the scales. Like, how many guys do you have to beat for it to equal one Hall of Fame win if the Hall of Famer's in their prime? Well, it's an awful lot. And so, 1 to 10 might not even be enough, but I know that knowing your system, knowing your system as well as you do, you will have found the ratio that gives the appropriate credit and run tests to see, what your system spits back out at you. So I can trust that you've done it coherently across the eras, and that, say for Langford, who at this point I've studied quite a bit. I know, and there's a huge amount of tough fights he had where these guys weren't pound for pound, but when you look at the people who also weren't pound for pound in those years, it's no surprise, because there's some great fighters who just couldn't push into the top 10 across the whole sport, because the sport was on fire. And so, certain guys, especially Langford, his fight to fight, there are some weak fights in there. There's some, like on a 10 scale, there are some ones in there, but there are a lot of 3s and 4s and 5s, and guys who should be in the Hall of Fame. Fights against Dave Holly, young Peter Jackson, they should be in the Hall of Fame. Jeff Clark. Jeff Clark his opposition score must have been monumental, because he's right up there, all-time top handful in fights and rounds against Hall of Famers. When you look at the fights he had, now he didn't have the winning element to be in this discussion, but if you're just talking purely in terms of how tough was someone matched, well, Jeff Clark has very few equals in all of history, and that includes many, many Hall of Famers did not have as many tough fights as he did, but you also have to win them. And I'm going to take the fork in the road, assuming that you have the different level of win weighted appropriately, that if I just go on broad statistics, when you go in the details, it'll average out close enough that hopefully, what I'm doing here will have some predictive success. Now, simultaneously, while I'm making note of resumes of a size and quality both that would suggest they're going to be inside 25, under the three broad categories, existing score, opposition faced, and beaten. I started to get a good sense of athletes I wanted to put in there, and simultaneously I'm looking at athletes where I felt like they were in that high in the rankings because of title success without context, rather than beating all-time greats for titles. They're winning titles against good fighters, but not great fighters necessarily. But the amount that they've been able to do it, especially in the era of infinite belts practically, more weight classes and more belts, to be fair. Still hard to get a title, but there's more opportunity to even compete for titles. And so athletes I felt that were high in the ranking because of that, they're going to fall back a little bit inevitably as other larger resumes with more tough fights in it and more quality wins in there are factored. And so I'm starting to get sort of in my mind a generic sense of who might be falling and who might be gaining, and some athletes who I think might be staying in a similar place, like Benny Leonard and Joe Gans. I think they're 13 and 15. I'm thinking that they, with all things considered, they may stay in that realm, like just loosely. That's what I had in my head. And other athletes like, say, Ali and Joe Louis, I was thinking they would be more maybe 19 and 20. And so basically I started just jotting this down on paper and then continually referencing back to my lists of the countdowns and the leaders in certain categories as far as what can be done without knowing every fight in a fighter's career, just a broad major fights, and then also looking at how many fights beyond those key fights each of my assumed top 25 athletes had that might nudge them up, or with the lack of all these additional fights, nudge them down. Like Jimmy McLarnin, I'm thinking of him somewhere in that 21 to 25 range because he had a magnificent career and he scores very highly in categories, but the overall size of his career, there are other athletes who had more tough fights and maybe won as many or more, and also had additional fights that would get them some small measure of extra point value. So what I came up with was sort of a shifting list of like probabilities, like certain guys, like especially the unassailable six, Langford, Greb, Robinson, Armstrong, Canzoneri, and Rosenbloom. Those I'm thinking those six will occupy 6 of the top 7 or 8 spots when it's all said and done, because they hit across so many categories. And as I'm trying to argue against where I have them in my improvised ranking, I'm not really finding an argument or other people who present a better argument to be above them, even some who have gigantic careers. So I'm just filling this in and trying to eliminate possibilities and just narrow it down, and then I'm going to apply some numbers. So if I'm making mistakes in the early part of this, obviously if I'm leaving out someone who's going to factor heavily inside 25, then that mistake will show later on, because I'm not going to be clashing 50 athletes all against each other, because I'm doing this attempting to do this in an time-efficient manner because of my schedule. Now, another athlete that I felt was going to factor inside 25 was the Giant Slayer, Jack Dillon, who had an enormous total career and also a highly significant number of top-level fights and wins. He really hits across all the categories, and going into the nitty-gritty of his career, that must have been one of the harder ones to do an opposition score for, or at least one of the longer ones. What a gigantic career he had. In 48th place in the top 500, and he actually rose 23 spots to 25th place in your top 1,000. And thinking about what I do know of his career, adding in the opposition faced and beaten element, given that 2/3 of the weight to the final rating, he makes a good argument to bump up close to or inside 15, so he's definitely going in. Other athletes I decided to put in, I went with Willie Pep, although I think he's going to be maybe in the higher numbers of the teens or in the early 20s in the final ranking, but inside 25, I do believe his stats and his massive overall career is going to put him in there. Emile Griffith, I'm putting inside 25, maybe not expecting him to make 15, but to make 25, I would think he's a very strong contender. So Griffith was in 14th and Gans was in 15th. Pacquiao debuted at 16th. I'm expecting him to lose some ground on the shorter career and the overall opposition, end up in 20-something or 30-something place. So he's not going to be factored into this. Next slot down, Willie Pep, I do believe he's going to at least stay inside 25. He had a gigantic career. Roberto Duran, I think his title accomplishments, rather than specifically his strength of opposition, has him as high as he is in the list, just below Pep. I don't believe he's going to be inside 25 when it's all said and done. ATTELL, I'm not sure of. We'll stick a pin in that one. Jimmy McLarnin, I already put in 25, in the lower 25, but inside 25. Ike Williams, again, I'm going to have to look into that more, so stick a pin in that one. Johnny Dundee had a gigantic 300-plus fight career, and he's already ranked decently. He's ranked inside 25. I do believe he's going to stay in there and possibly rise. He lost 9 spots in the recent rankings update. I'm not sure why, maybe a lack of title accomplishment, but if that's what it was, or whatever stat categories he didn't quite hit on all of them enough to stay as high as he was, he's going to gain a lot of that back and then some with the opposition score and the opposition beaten. So that -9 spots, that should be reversed to some degree. Tommy Loughran himself lost 11 spots between the top 500 and top 1000 update. I do believe he's going to gain. I'm going to have him inside 25. Okay, so this seems like a great time to review. In the final 25, we ended up with Sam Langford, Sugar Ray Robinson, Harry Greb, Hank Armstrong, Maxie Rosenbloom, and Tony Canzoneri as the unassailable 6. To these we added Archie Moore, Jack Britton, Muhammad Ali, Ezard Charles, Joe Louis, Ted Kid Lewis, Benny Leonard, Emile Griffith, and Joe Gans. And the remaining 10 to finish out, I chose Willie Pep, Jimmy McLarnin, Johnny Dundee, Tommy Loughran, Harry Wills, Barbados Walcott, Jack Johnson, Jack Dillon, Mickey Walker, and Freddie Miller. So thanks for tuning in. I'm going to be pondering over these 25, and I'm fairly confident from within this 25, the eventual top 15 will emerge. So thanks for tuning in. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.